Hello guys, this is Mr. Cole. Last video lecture for the week. This one is going to be about Ronald Reagan, our 40th president, and involves um, uh, basically his domestic policies, his policies here at home and in the rest of the world will be on next week. So with that, we are actually going to skip forward a little bit. So I'm going to skip the Cold War stuff. There's Ronald Reagan. Interesting president, did not follow the normal traditional route. Ronald Reagan was actually a famous actor during the 1950s and 1960s. And then eventually in the 1970s and 60s got into politics, eventually becoming the governor of California. And then in 1981 becoming the 40th president of the United States. Now, as you can imagine, Ronald Reagan was elected as a result of how poor the economy was doing, the kind of perception of Jimmy Carter as president. The people turned back to a Republican president to look for someone to stimulate the economy and finally get the economy back on track, because we're still dealing with a really, really poor job situation in the country. So like I said, I'm going to skip forward. We're going to do all that stuff in a second. Now, Ronald Reagan is very, very famous for his belief of a small national government, a national government that stays out of things. He has a very famous joke, and I always think it's funny, so I'll share it with you. He said the scariest sentence and the scariest two sentences in the English language are this: first, I'm here from the federal government, and I'm here to help. And that's what Reagan really viewed government as, causing problems for everyday people. And so Reagan's going to take that philosophy and apply it to his economic plan. His economic plan, that we now famously call Reaganomics, dealt with what we call trickle-down economics. The idea was to provide incentives to wealthy individuals and corporations, to give them extra money and give them extra benefits, because in turn they will use that money to provide more jobs for middle-class Americans, which will improve the situation for everybody. What Reaganomics called for and what they did was tax cuts and tax cuts and tax cuts. Huge tax cuts on the richest Americans, huge tax cuts on corporations. And hopefully the idea was that then that extra money they got, they would invest in their corporations, they would invest in their businesses, which would hire more Americans for that. Now, you got to pay for this, though, okay? And Reagan's way of paying for these tax cuts was to start cutting government spending on the social programs of the 1960s. Things like the welfare programs, the food stamps, the housing, all that stuff that Lyndon B. Johnson had done, Reagan's going to start cutting those. Okay, and one of the criticisms of Reagan is that he cut those programs so much that his policies favored the rich and hurt the poor. Along with this, and we'll get into that later on. Along with this, Reagan is going to argue that the federal government needs to stay out of business. Let business do the thing. Reagan's kind of like a 1920s president, right? Let the business world do their thing and stay out of it. So Reagan is going to be famous for deregulation, for cutting back on federal rules on industry. Things like environmental rules. Reagan is going to cut a lot of those EPA rules that we had talked about. Things like job protections and minimum wage and those sorts of regulations. He's going to pull back on some of those. Okay, letting businesses thrive. It was his idea. I think this quote really sums up Reagan's philosophy really well. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And that's how he viewed it. The government needed to stay out of this. Now, you will see in your homework assignment the impact of Reaganomics and analyze his policy and if it was good for the country or bad for the country. But it really becomes kind of the modern Republican Party's stance. Famously, Republicans nickname themselves the Party of Lincoln because Lincoln was the first Republican president. But really, they're the Party of Reagan. And Reagan's economic policies are still carried on today. President Trump's policies are very closely aligned to what Reagan was trying to do and kind of set the tone for what it means to be a Republican here in the 20th and 21st century. So what your job to do is to look more. I intentionally went light on this notes session so that your job is to go through and look at Reagan's policy and see if you agree with it or disagree with it. Okay? All right, guys, great job this week. See ya. Bye.